Scarcely 2 weeks had gone by, and already we were on our way back out to work in the cave. We admit we have become obsessed with the idea of getting through the passage. That may be a sign of how exciting our lives really are. It's not that we think there's going to be something great beyond the passage, we just like the idea of being the first humans on the face of the planet to set foot in the virgin part of the cave. Although if we found a hidden treasure, that would be fine with us. We got a late start and drove part of the way in the dark. When I tell people that I go caving at night, they wonder why. They don't stop to think that it's always night once you're inside a cave. All the way out to Mystery Cave, we talked about new ideas to speed up our work. B also told me he talked to some caver friends of his that came up with an explanation about the rumbling noise. They thought it might be the sound of water deep within the cave, possibly a waterfall. They couldn't really explain why the noise seemed to come and go. To me, it is just one more reason to get through, so we can solve the mystery. This trip we took B's dog, Whip. She's a Jack Russell Terrier. I was not at all concerned about taking the dog into the cave. We had taken her before. She answers the call of nature before we go in, and then waits until we get out again. And she is well behaved inside the cave. We simply had to lower her via custom-made harness until she reached the bottom of the main drop. Then she negotiated the rest on her own. She loves to explore, but won't go out of our sight. She doesn't have a light attached to her, so she has to wait around for us. Another reason I don't mind bringing Whip along was because we planned on putting her into a small hole to see how far the passage she would go. That might give us an idea of what is on the other side. We knew that if there was a drop-off that we couldn't see, the dog would turn around and come right back at us. We thought we might have to do some work on the hole before even the dog could get through. Despite working in the dark of the night, we were able to rig up and get down pretty quickly. We didn't take as many tools as last time, plus we left some in the hole so we didn't have to haul them out and back in again. I did manage to get 2 more batteries for the drills, for a total of 4. Also, a few more masonry drill bits. Even with the dog, we made good time getting down. Then something bizarre happened that I honestly can't quite explain. The dog began exploring as soon as we let her off the rope. She was in dog heaven, sniffing and darting around our feet. She would run from one person to the other as we made our way back to the work site. At the point the cave splits into 4 passages, the dog seemed to run out of juice. She just stuck right by either B or me. And that seemed kinda odd. As we progressed further into the cave, she would only stay by B. She seemed edgy, like she saw something she didn't like. As we approached the short drop-off before the hole, she stopped and would only come further after we coaxed her. The hair on her back stood on end. Finally, as we got to within 20 feet of the hole, she began to whimper and hide behind B. Her tail was between her legs and she was cowering down on the ground. Strange. I mean, I'd seen her square off with dogs twice her size, but now she acted as if Satan himself was lurking in the darkness. I figured there must have been animals that used the cave as a home, and Whip smelled their scent. Too bad it upset her, because there was no way she was going into the passage. We decided that with this new development, the nervous dog, one of us would work while the other stayed with the dog a few feet away from where we normally rested. We got right back into our routine of drilling, hammering, etc. With our extra supply of batteries, we were able to really push hard on the drill and not have to worry about using up the batteries. This did not make our work any easier, though, but it did speed things up a little bit. Progress was still slow. I really didn't mind, though. My journal goes on for a while about the progress we were making. The entire time we worked, Whip did not move. She just laid there on a rope bag, shivering. She would whimper from time to time. One thing I didn't think about at the time was that she would not take her eyes off of the hole. We should have been more observant of this intuitive animal. We were on our 4th battery when the second bizarre thing happened to us. B was working. He had just finished drilling a hole and was getting ready to hammer the bullpen when he stopped working and looked into the hole. I was kicking back, almost asleep, and hardly paying attention to B. He had a light by his side to illuminate the work area. I could see in the eerie glow a puzzled and intense look on his face. He looked over at me and shook his head. I asked him what was up, and he said that he swore that he just heard a strange noise emanating from the hole. He said it sounded like rock sliding on rock, sort of a grinding sound. I assumed his ears were just ringing from the drill. He didn't wear any earplugs this trip. He assured me that he heard what he said he had heard. I don't have an explanation, so I went back to dozing. B sat in the quiet of the cave for a long time before he resumed work. Also, he would stop from time to time and just listen. B is very grounded and not one to pursue some imaginary sound. I believe he heard something, but I'm not too concerned about what it was. I assume we will figure it out, once we get through the passage. The final battery lasted another hour or so. We were sitting around talking about our progress when I decided to see if I could get my head through the hole. My head easily fit, but there was no way my shoulders were going in. As I was kneeling there, contemplating how close we were, I noticed something that B overlooked. The wind had stopped. In all of the times I had been in the cave, I always felt like the wind blowing. The last time we were out working on the cave, the wind was blowing worse than ever. Even earlier, we remember the breeze cooling us off, but now, nothing. B said he did not know when it stopped. The rumbling had ceased, too. Bizarre. This plain old cave was becoming mysterious. We talked for a long time in the dark of the cave. We debated what could possibly even be causing these events to occur. I think part of the reason we were sitting in the dark was because we were too hammered to move. We would come up with no reasonable explanation for the strange things happening in the cave. After sitting for at least a half hour, we slowly loaded up our gear and started for the surface. Whip couldn't have been more happier to get out of there. Once again, we left some of the tools in the cave. We just put them in the hole. Not enough people use the cave to even worry about. Plus, we were too tired to even care. We made a lot of progress this trip. It helps to have the extra batteries. We still have a long way to go, but it sure is nice to see how far we have come. In retrospect, I can't believe how casual we were about everything that was happening in the cave. At the time, the only thing we could think about was getting into the passage. Everything else was just a minor distraction. I do recall thinking that it would be nice to get in and see how the mechanics of the cave worked, where the wind was coming from, what was making the noise. Now, weeks later, I think of my ignorance and naivete. And shiver. It took us 3 weeks before we got back out to Mystery Cave again. Our attitudes have changed a bit since we first started the project. In the beginning, we looked at the whole thing as a fun adventure. Since the last trip out, we found ourselves taking a more serious approach. On the drive out this time, our conversation was a little more subdued than before. We hadn't talked much about the last trip. Not for any reason but scheduling conflicts. Instead of discussing ways of getting through the passage, we found ourselves talking about rational explanations for what had even happened. Neither one of us had any ideas that would explain the unusual occurrences we experienced on the last trip. We were amused to find out that neither one of us had talked much about the last trip to even other people. That is a complete reversal from the other trips. It has been fun to report to friends and family about our progress. It is always fun to tell people about the tight squeeze we are going to have to go through to get into the passage. Most people have little desire to voluntarily subject themselves to incredibly tight places. And actually, neither do I. But I will do it in order to get to the other side. Good motivation. We left town early in the afternoon to beat traffic. I don't really recall what time we finally got to the cave. Like I said, the mood was subdued. We got rigged up and started down. Obviously, B left his dog home this time. We took essentially the same gear as the last time. We left some of the tools in the hole to save our backs the agony of hauling the extra weight. Even with the gear we got down in good time, we really have a good system for getting up and down. There was only one minor mishap this trip. B scraped his arm on the descent. Not real bad, fortunately. He waited until we got all the way to the hole to patch it up. It was just a superficial cut. While he was getting the wound cleaned up, I started working. We both took note that the breeze was back and the rumbling present. We had 4 fresh batteries and 4 or maybe 3.5 fresh arms. I had high hopes that this would be the day. It started out pretty slow. When we first started working on the hole, the thickness was about 3 inches. As we have enlarged the hole, the thickness has increased. As a result, our progress has become slower. Still, we continued with as much energy as we could put into the work. The hole was big enough, at least for me, to put the hammer into the hole for reference, then put the camera into the hole and take a picture of Floyd's tomb. It had been nice to see a pile of broken rock below the hole get bigger and bigger. We have both realized that we are just going to have to put in a certain amount of work in order to get through, so we just get down to business. We usually don't even talk much while at work. Since one of us is making a lot of noise with the drill or hammer, break times are used to chat momentarily about whatever topic pops into mind. The breaks take place whenever the guy that's working decides to switch roles. We both put in some pretty good work sessions. I have a little bit more stamina than B, but he gets just as much done in a shorter amount of time due to his upper body strength. We still celebrate the small victories we encounter along the way. Whenever a section we've been working on crumbles, we cheer. On a rare occasion that a fist-sized rock falls into the entrance, we whoop and holler. That's one small chunk of earth that no longer separates us from whatever lies on the other side. I still harbor the fantasy that there is a hidden entrance to the other side of the passage, and years ago, Spanish explorers hid their treasures in the cave and sealed up the entrance, and it has remained untouched until we find it. B has a more realistic, although more mundane theory. He figures that there is more cave on the other side. Well, we'll see who's right. This trip, I wanted to see if we could speed up the work by using larger masonry bits. I purchased some good-sized ones at a hardware store at a good-sized price. One was larger in diameter than all the rest, the others was smaller around but longer. I had pretty much concluded that the big one would be too big, and I was right. We tried to get it into the rock, but progress was very slow. We tried pushing for all we were worth, and all we got was tired. The larger bit just created too much friction area for our strength. It might have worked with a hammer drill, but we don't have one. The longer bit worked fine with our drill. We relied on it for most of the work we did this trip. I thought we were going to be out one bit and a drill in my hand, but the bit broke off towards one end. I was pushing as hard as I could on the drill with a bit of a few inches on the wall when it snapped. I nearly rammed the drill through the wall from pushing so hard. We were able to retrieve the last bit and keep using it, minus a couple inches. It still worked great. The bit was fine. Only once in a great while we resorted to hammer and chisel, work proceeded as normal, until about the time we were on our fourth battery. I was kneeling down and working the drill slowly into the wall at a time. I had my earplugs in, my safety glasses on, and was lost in my own thoughts. Suddenly, over the squeal of the drill wearing down the rock, I heard a strange noise. And it was loud. I could hear it over the noise of the drill, even though I had the earplugs in. At first, I thought it was just the drill bit doing its job in the cave. It would frequently complain by screeching and whining as we forced it into the wall, but this was different. It took me several full seconds to comprehend that this was coming from inside the hole, and not the bit. I stopped drilling and yanked my earplugs out just in time to hear the most terrible scream I'd ever heard trail off and echo into the darkness of the cavern. I stared wide-eyed at the hole. For several minutes, I didn't move, nor did I breathe. I turned to look at B. Moments earlier, he had been lying on the rope back catching a nap. Now, he was standing upright, mouth open, and with a look of concern on his face. I turned around and looked into the hole again, half expecting to see a demon face staring back at me. Nothing was different in Floyd's tomb. I fixed my gaze on the back of the squeeze, where the limits of my light reached. There was no motion, only darkness beyond the reaches of my light. In the complete silence that followed, I heard my heart pounding in my ears. Not another sound could be heard in the cave. Suddenly, I heard a scraping noise behind me and straightened up. I nearly knocked myself out by hitting my head on the overhang. It was just B moving to turn on his light. But I was so wired, it nearly sent me to my grave. B spoke, and again I jumped. He said to get some rocks and put them into the hole. He explained that whatever animal had made that noise might be able to get through the hole. I immediately grabbed a few rocks and hoisted them through the opening. Using the handle of the sledgehammer, I slid the rocks as far back into the tunnel as I could, creating a wall between us and the other side. Since the squeeze is so small, it didn't take long. The entire time I was doing this, however, I was thinking that the noise certainly did not come from an animal. I don't know if B really thought it was, or if he was just trying to convince himself. I didn't say anything to him about what I had thought. From the time it happened to the writing of the journal entry 2 days later, I have tried to come up with some possible source for such a noise. I described it would say it sounded like a cross between a man screaming in fear and a cougar screaming in pain. It sounded like it came from the hole and was roughly 100 feet away. The horrific noise reverberated through the cave, and through my ears. B estimated the scream lasted 8 to 10 seconds. My best guess is about 5. 3 seconds while I was drilling, 1.5 seconds to drop the drill and yank the earplugs, and half a second of sheer terror. It's difficult to tell how much time passes when you're listening to a solo from the depths of Hades. After I filled the back of the passage with rocks, we just sat there listening to the silence. My breathing was a lot more rapid than usual. Neither of us spoke for quite some time. Finally, B suggested we get back to work, but keep an eye out for movement in that hole. We put a light in the passage that shined to the back of Floyd's tomb. It was only at this point that we realized that wind had stopped again, and the rumbling could no longer be heard. To say I was nervous would be an understatement. I didn't say anything to B, nor him to me. Back to the drilling, B took over the work, which was fine with me. I wasn't exactly worn out, but I didn't mind being further from that hole. B would stop from time to time and listen. I just sat watching him with my light on. I wasn't close to the entrance of the hole, but I still found myself looking behind me down the passage to the still water. Every time my light would cast an unusual shadow, my heart would jump. My imagination was running wild. Oddly, B seemed to be less concerned about the strange noise than me. After a short time, he seemed to be focused entirely on getting through the passage. I was still straining to listen above the sound of the drill. I heard nothing but the now familiar sound of carbide on stone. As I contemplated the possible scenarios which might play out on the other side of the passage, I found myself strangely getting somewhat excited again through the idea of getting through that hole. It might have been fatigue taking its toll on my mind, or the thought of something valuable on the other side. My thoughts were broken when B let out a yell, possibly a cuss word. He said the drill battery was dying, but he hadn't quite broken off a large relative section he was working on. He set the useless drill aside and picked up a hammer and bullpen. He started wailing away at the hole created by the bit, and after nearly 10 solid minutes of hammering, he sat back against the rock, sweating and nearly out of breath. The bullpen was still protruding from the cave wall. He held the hammer towards me, inviting me to take a few swings. I held up my hand and shook my head. I had been ready to exit this cave for quite a while now. I didn't press the issue, and without speaking, we both started gathering the gear we were going to take out. Once again, we stashed some of the tools in the passage. I was first to start towards the top of the cave several times. I had to stop and wait for B, not because he was moving slow. I was just more eager to get out. Few times have I felt better than that night, stepping out into the chilly night air. My journal talks about the rest of the evening, our dinner, our decision to get a motel and come back the next day, our lengthy discussion of the strange sounds we had heard, another mediocre night's sleep. I cannot believe that we were so willing to get right back into the cave after hearing that scream. Part of the reason I went along with the idea was because B seemed so indifferent to any possible dangers. Even if it were an animal, which I did not believe, but could offer no better explanation, weren't we possibly putting ourselves in harm's way? In retrospect, I still have difficulty understanding our thought process at that time. We were just too eager to discover virgin cave passages. I now think it can be summed up with one word: testosterone. It's amazing what a good couple meals and a little sleep can do for someone's attitude. Even though we still had memories of the strange noise fresh in our minds, we relit our fire of enthusiasm. The other side of the passage seemed so close. We were sure this day would be the day. We got to the cave and started to work the way down the hole. Getting back into the darkness brought back the memories of the night before. The sight of the circle of rock illuminated by our headlamps, the smell of dirt in the air, the sound we made as we crawled through the rock. Once we reached the entrance of Floyd's tomb, however, we were once again ready to blaze the trail leading to an undiscovered part of the cave. We immediately noted the presence of the breeze blowing out of the hole and the rumbling. The bullpen sticking out of its hole was an obvious sign of where we needed to begin work for the next day. B took over where he left off the day before. I took up residence in the same spot I occupied the night before, even though I was already well rested and wanting to start work. B was making the hammer sing with each blow. After a mere 2 or 3 minutes, he let out a cheer. He turned to reveal a handful of rock that used to be attached to a cave. He was breathing heavy, but had a big smile on his face. So did I. For the time, the strange noise had been forgotten, and the vision of success captured our attention. The lower left-hand corner of the hole had been giving us grief. Because of the thickness of the wall at that point, we felt that if we could just remove that corner, we might be on our way inside. B now held in his hand the crumbled remains of the corner. Our excitement consumed us as we examined the hole. I took the hammer and pounded away the surface of the hole. The idea was to remove the jagged edges that would take their toll on my skin. The size looked right. Now, the moment we had been working for. I cautiously approached the entrance of Floyd's tomb. I decided the best way to enter the small hole was to place one arm over my head, turn my head sideways, and slowly work my way in. I soon determined this was not going to work. The hole was small. If I was going to make it in without widening the hole anymore, I was going to have to put both arms over my head in a diving position, turn my head sideways, and slip into the tomb. The width of the entrance was the limiting factor. The height was sufficient. The arms overhead position flared my shoulder blades out, but there was still room to get in. Plus, the arms overhead gave me the best squeeze side to side. In order to enter straight into the hole, I stood on my feet and bent over to get to level with the entrance at least. My knees were bent and the position was uncomfortable, sort of a semi-squatting position. Bent at the waist with arms overhead, plus I had to slightly turn my upper torso to the left in a counterclockwise rotation to negotiate the angle of the entrance. Notice in that last photo, the entrance generally slopes up to the right. I got my arm through the entrance with minor scrapes. Next came my head. By keeping it turned sideways, I was able to get it in, for the most part up to my shoulders. When I got to my shoulders, I could feel the rocks touching all around my shoulders and chest. It was not stopping me, but it was definitely scraping many surfaces on my body. I decided to just push through, keeping in mind that I was going to have to come back out eventually. The pain was not too bad, and I was in. Well, my upper body was in, at least. I could get a good idea of what the tomb was going to look like, though. Once inside, I had a few inches all around to me, which to position my body. This was the largest part of the passage, and it was conveniently located right at the beginning of the crawl. That gave me a little room to get positioned into crawl further into the passage. Inside the tomb gave me a whole new outlook of what it was going to be like to crawl through. Even though this was the largest part of the crawl, it was still small. I could move my head around freely, but every direction that I turned, I was staring at a wall of solid rock. When I spoke to B, my voice sounded muffled, like I was talking in a small box. I could rest my chest on the passage floor, but the rocks were uncomfortable. I turned my head to look further ahead, but couldn't see past the wall of rocks I had built the day before. The squeeze towards the end of the passage was closer now, and appeared even narrower. I didn't know if I could squeeze through or not. I knew it would be close. I wanted to crawl further into the passage first, however. I had to work to get some of the loose rocks that were lying on the passage floor out of my way. I was disappointed to find out that most of the rocks that looked loose were actually attached to the floor. I was just hoping to be able to scrape them out of the way. I had pushed the sledgehammer into the passage before me, so at this point I used it to push the rock wall that we had made further back into the passage. Then I dragged the sledge back and forth across the floor to move any loose rocks, or break up any solid ones. By sliding the head of the hammer under the squeeze, I determined that the narrowest part of the squeeze was about 7 inches high. I figured we would just have to do some work before I could slip through. The entire time I had my head in the passage, B was just kicking back, listening to my descriptions and progress reports. At some point, he snapped the photo shown above. Thanks, B. Up to this point, the size of the passage was not too big of a deal. I was in an incredibly small area, but only my upper body was in. And since it was the largest part of the passage, my arms could move freely. I was actually pretty calm. And then it was time for a push. I slid the sledgehammer up as far as I could reach. Since my body filled the entrance, I could not slip the tool out, so it was easier to push it ahead. In order to rotate my hips to the proper angle to enter the hole, I had to clean my upper body on my forearms, use my feet to climb the wall outside the hole, and slowly crawl into the hole. My hips barely fit. Once they cleared the entrance, I could relax a bit and get in position to work towards the squeeze. I decided to try the one-arm forward technique to get through. The passage was so narrow that whatever position I started with, I would have to stay with through the entire length. There was just no room to move around or change positions. I would have to turn my head one way or another and keep it in the same position. This crawl was tight. Moving forward at this part of the passage relatively easily. I could use my forward arm, my left one, to pull and my other arm to push. At this point, I would wiggle my body, trying to arch as much as I could to keep my chest off the rocks. I tried both ways and determined that I would have to turn my head to the right. It felt the most comfortable. I began to learn things as I went. I determined that a small flashlight in one hand would be nice, that I could shine it ahead and get a better idea of what I was about to crawl over. This was a difficult maneuver because I had to look overhead. Since my head was turned, I immediately found that it was obvious that we were going to have to do some more work, removing rocks from the passage floor. As I moved along the surface, I was constantly scraping my chest on the rocks. They were sharp and painful. Occasionally, I would cause a rock to slide along my chest, and it actually wedged me between it and the top of the passage. I then have to back up and either try to move the rock to the side with my cheek, using a sweeping motion with my head, or back way out and move it with my forward hand. My little trip into the passage represented a major milestone in my caving career. When I began caving, I did not feel overly comfortable going through tight spaces. Even the little squeeze at the beginning of the cave was an obstacle to overcome. By pushing myself and forcing myself to try the narrow passages, I had become much more calmer about tight spaces. Still, this passage represented a new benchmark in small spaces. I had not faced with anything this small. I don't remember having to take my helmet off before. With this passage, it's mandatory. And as I mentioned before, not only do I have to take off my helmet, but I have to turn my head to the side in order to fit. The journey into the tomb went like this. After I twisted my hips into the passage, I took a few minutes to stop and work out a game plan. Most of the length of my legs was still around the entrance. They were just dangling in the air. The tomb was still big enough to move my head around, and even move my arms freely into position. It was larger than the rest of the passage, but not by much. It was like sticking your head into a box. Everywhere I looked there were rocks, but not too far from my head. Any sound I made was muffled and dead. The narrowest part of the passage is about 10 feet in. At this point, I was 3.5 feet in. At about the 4-foot mark, I'd have to commit to whatever position I felt comfortable and stay that way until the 12-foot mark, at which time the cave started opening up. I went with my left arm forward and headed towards the right. B had given me a flashlight that I had held in my left hand. As I inched forward, I would try to brush the loose rocks away from my left arm. This was somewhat successful, but there were a lot of rocks I missed or couldn't move. As mentioned, the first little bits of the crawl moved along fairly quickly. Since there was little room above me to negotiate the passage, Then the walls started closing around me. I had a few extra inches on each side of me, but on the top of the crawl, it was getting very low. At about the 7-foot mark, I could feel the top rubbing my back as I would arch. And after another half foot, I couldn't arch anymore. I just had to push ahead with my toes and pulled with my forward arm. I decided it would be a good time to see if I could back out. I tried it, and it was pretty easy. That gave me a lot more confidence. Still, I had B-tie webbing to my feet, just in case he had to pull me out. My neck was starting to get sore from being cranked to the side. My head was getting heavy, but to rest, I only had the option to just lay it down on the broken rocks. It was painful. I did it frequently. I was staring at the wall to my right. It was a mere 4 to 5 inches from my face. Most of the time, I wasn't watching it. Either I had my eyes closed, which I sometimes do when I go through a tight spot, or the light wasn't shining in a direction that did me any good. It was very quiet on the tomb, other than my own breathing. I was breathing heavily from the effort it took to move. Thankfully, the breeze was present and it cooled me off. By lifting my head and carefully touching the ceiling from time to time, I could gauge the size of the passage that my body would soon pass through. Much like a cat using its whiskers to gauge an opening in the fence, at the 7.5-foot mark, I could tell things were going to get real tight. While lying in the darkness in a passage deep within a cave, one is in a unique position to ponder. A mountain literally resting on top of me, the entire earth lying below. One tiny movement of earth, and I cease to exist. Or worse, to recognize the fear shared by Floyd Collins as he lay there, trapped for days deep within the heart of Mother Earth, incapable of freeing himself from his earthen prison. Picture yourself in my position. Lying on your stomach, your left arm is extended over your head, your right arm is at your side, having only a few inches in which to move. Your arms and hands are sore and bleeding from crawling, pulling yourself across the broken rocks. Your entire body is resting on the rocks. Your neck gets tired of holding your head off, the rocks, as you gently rest your cheek on the rock to rest. Once you start again, you have to push with your toes to scoot your body forward. Sliding across the rocks, after moving a few inches, you're breathing hard. And you have to rest. As you inhale, you can feel your back pressing hard against the top of the squeeze. It takes several minutes before you recover enough to press forward. The entire time you're lying there, you think about how you are going to get back out. And what if? Well, that's pretty much what I was going through, and at that point in the passage, I decided this would be a good time to throw in a photo of the squeeze. The photo's actually taken on a different trip, but it shows how tight things were at the point in the passage. Notice my head turned to the side, not by choice, but you can see how I would rest my cheek on the rocks. You can see how difficult it is, to look ahead of me. My arms are pinned to the side. I later determined this would be the best position. There is virtually no space between the top of the passage and my back. Tight. Not for the claustrophobically inclined. When I reached the point where my back was rubbing and I could feel with my head the passage was not getting bigger, I knew I was most likely not going to get through. Still, I decided to give it one more push. I had not been in this position a year ago. I would have been in a state of panic, but not today. I was pretty pumped. I took a few minutes to rest, and then I went for it. I exhaled completely out of air, all the air in my lungs. This caused my chest to collapse enough to scoot forward a few inches. Because it takes so much effort to scoot, I only went a few inches before I had to stop and breathe. As I inhaled, my chest pressed hard against the floor and my back against the top. It took a little longer to get my breath back. Unbelievably, I did it again. Exhale, scoot, rest. Again, only a few inches. Repeat. I took a few extra minutes to enjoy this position. Pinned in the small passage, I couldn't believe how relaxed I was. I tried one more time to exhale and scoot. My back was rubbing too much to continue. Despite the failed, effort, I was psyched. It took several minutes to lay there and recover from the effort. B had been encouraging me the entire time. It was fun to hear him cheer as he saw my shoes go deeper and deeper into the hole. Backing out was not too difficult, but it did take some work. I encountered the same obstacles as when I went in after I wiggled my hips out of the hole, which took some time. I had trouble getting my shoulders out. Both arms were overhead at this point. My shirt was getting caught on the rocks, and my shoulders were bruising the sharp rocks. After struggling to find a good position, I gave up and just pulled my upper body out. My shirt pulled up over my head and I got a bunch of scrapes on my shoulders, but I don't care. To me, this trip was a success. I pushed myself beyond what I thought was possible. I kneeled at the entrance and looked into the narrow passage I had just been in. The rock wall was now at the 11-foot mark. I had to push it a little with my forward arm. The smallest point was at the 9-foot mark. We were close. Between the work and the excitement, I was tired. I just sat on the rope bag, grinning. What a trip. The rest of our journal entry talks about our usual climb out, dinner, trip home, etc. On the way home, we brainstormed and came up with ideas that would help us get through. We both invented some tools to remove the rock on the floor deep within the passage. We were both very excited by this trip. I, from pushing my limits on the cave, and B, from his success in climbing out of the cave. This was the first time he was able to climb all the way out without the help of climbing devices, nor my help. It was a personal success that showed the progress he had made since the accident. Pretty cool. I remained amazed that we could so easily forget the terrifying moment we experienced just the day before. All had been forgotten with the strange noise being blamed in our minds on some rational, harmless explanation. Prior to going back out to Mystery Cave again, we spent a lot of time prepping. We made a squeeze box, which is a wooden box, the opening of which can be adjusted in size. We would then crawl through the opening and measure how tight of a squeeze we could fit through. From that, we were able to determine that I need about 8 inches in height in order to get through the smallest portion of Floyd's tomb. That means we would have to scrape out about an inch from the floor of the passage. We also learned that the best position I would need to get through the passage would be on my stomach, with my arms on my side, and of course, my head would be turned one way or the other. That position allowed my shoulder blades to drop to their lowest point. In order to move, I would push forward or backwards with my toes. It sounds difficult, but felt adequate. Later, it proved to work sufficiently. The second thing we did was to construct the tools we invented to work within the cave. I came up with a clever way to chip away the inside of the passage without having to climb inside. I had my neighbor weld together several lengths of steel pipe in a manner that would allow us to take it apart when we climbed down to the tomb, but still have the strength necessary to hold up to a blow from a hammer once it was together. We made our own tips that we could screw in our pipe to reach the area we needed to work on. B came up with a cool design for a scraper using angle iron. He had his neighbor weld it together. It proved to be an invaluable tool for scraping and removing the rock. We were both proud of our inventions. I also made a device to hold my drill that attached to our pipe. We ended up not using it since B's scraper device had worked so well. I took an oath. I made a vow. I would not leave the cave until I had made it through the passage, conquered Floyd's tomb. This would be the trip. It had been a long time since we had been out to Mystery. We had been busy, though. We had made the tools that we had talked about. It was fun coming up with the ideas for tools. Also, we made a squeeze box to determine the best technique for getting through the tight spot. Plus, we knew about how much rock we needed to remove before we could get through. We were excited to get back out to the cave to finish our project. Our climb down the passage took a little bit longer than usual since we had extra tools to carry. Once we got down to the passage, we immediately got to work using B's scraping tool with the pipe I had made. It worked like a charm. We could hammer the pipe on one end and the scraping tool on the other end dug into the rock. Then we could push the debris all the way through the passage and out of our way. When we needed to measure our progress, we would turn the scraper sideways in the passage and observe the clearance. We worked for about 2 hours before I had a desire to try the tomb. I just wanted to make sure I was going to make it through the first try. B made one more sweep of the passage floor, clearing any loose rocks from where I would be crawling and pushing the wall we had made to the back of the squeeze. I made preparations for the crawl by fashioning duct tape suspenders to suspend my shirt from sliding around while sliding across the rock. I went with a flashlight in my hand. Even though my hand would be at my side, I knew I would need it once I got through. As an expression of faith, I did not tie a rope to my feet. I was confident that I was going to make it. Finally, I made the attempt. Although I didn't mention it in my journal, we did notice the breeze was back and the rumbling present. Since we didn't do any work to the entrance, I had to go through the same dance routine to even enter the passage. Once I got my upper body through the hole, I shined the flashlight ahead of me to work out a plan of attack. The passage didn't seem any bigger than the first time I was there, but most of the work was done deeper in the squeeze. I paused for a few minutes, then twisted my hips to get my lower body in. I slowly inched forward as my entire body slowly filled the passage, but I was completely in. I got into position for the push. I dropped both of my hands to my sides and turned my head to the right. Then I began to inch forward. Once my toes were inside the cave, I used them to push forward. To keep me from scraping my body, I would walk using my shoulders, knees, and toes. Progress was slow but steady, and that was fine by me. A foot or two before the tight spot, I could already tell there was a little more room, even so I began to touch the roof of the passage with my back. This time, however, I was able to continue moving forward. I reached the lowest point in the passage, and I could tell that it was going to be tricky. Even with the work we had done cleaning out the loose rocks, I still felt sharp pebbles rolling under my chest as I slid along. When I could feel my back brushing the top of the passage in several places, I reverted to my technique of exhaling. Before I began, however, I took a minute to lay there in the passage. I could see the glow of B's flashlight as the rays of light managed to squeeze past my body. I could feel the cool breeze evaporate, the drops of dirty sweat on my forehead. I could feel 1,000 sharp edges dig into the surface of my skin. I felt a twinge of excitement as I realized that the goal we had set out to achieve weeks ago was about to be realized. The thought alone made me want to keep moving. No matter how tight the passage became, I breathed it in and out rapidly for a few moments, then began. Exhale, scoot, stop to catch my breath, repeat. After just a few inches of scooting, I could raise my head off the floor of the squeeze and tell that the passage was beginning to open up. I relayed this information to B, and we both took a few seconds to celebrate. During the rest of the slide, though, the passage B was cheering me on. Virgin passage in Neil Armstrong territory were the phrases he kept repeating. I was grinning ear to ear. Even though the passage was beginning to get larger, it was still slow going. I had to continue scooting along for another 1.5 feet before I could slide my arms underneath me to use them to crawl. At that point, I felt my journey was essentially over. I was able to sit up slightly and move the rock wall we had erected several trips ago. These rocks served as a somber reminder to a little caution would be wise. I shouted back to B that I was through. We both took a moment to congratulate ourselves on our success. B would likely never be able to squeeze through the passage and see what I was seeing, so I gave him a description of what the cave looked like. At this point I only had my mini-mag, so I could not see very far into the passage. The end of the passage made a gentle right turn and seemed to go for a ways. I was unable to do anything at this point but sit. Due to the size of the passage, all the broken rocks we had pushed through Floyd's tomb were around me at this point. There was no other signs of human intrusion. I had to wait until B passed me my helmet light to get a better feel for the cave. B used the pole we made to slide me the end of a rope. Then I was able to pull all my gear through the squeeze. The first thing we sent was the helmet and light. After I got the light fired up, I was able to see our new section of cave. Hours! It was an exciting experience to see results of hours of hard work over the course of several weeks. At this point, we still had no idea what the cave had to offer. The only thing I could see with the passage immediately following the squeeze, it was a narrow passage with a low ceiling. I was easily able to get through it, but I would have to crawl. I began taking pictures so I could show B. I asked B how far he thought I should venture into the new cave. The light of strange events that had occurred. For the first time, he too toned down his enthusiasm as he remembered the noises. He slid the pipe through the tomb with a loosened tip on the end. He said I could use it as a weapon if I ran into an animal or whatever. He also told me to make sure we could hear each other as I progressed through the cave. Even though we were at least thinking of the possibilities of running into trouble, we never really considered the fact that if I got into trouble, B would never be able to rescue me. And in fact, no one would ever be able to get to me for many hours. If I were in serious trouble as in hurt, there was no way anybody would be able to get to me in time. But symbolic of the whole experience, we were focused on our goal, and not the potential dangers we faced. So far, we had dodged the proverbial bullet. So far. I strapped on my gloves and knee pads, grabbed my camera, and began my adventure. I crawled through the passage pictured above, which was about 20 feet long. At the end of the crawl, the cave bent slightly to the right. I'd have to climb up a gentle slope, but then I'd be able to stand on the end of the section of the cave. The section was about 40 feet long. In addition to having a higher ceiling, the walls were a little wider than the section I'd just crawled through. Both sections were relatively straight. The floor was covered by rock, which was crunched as I crawled, and then walked across it. The walls were basically the same as much of the mystery cave, except pristine. It was obvious no one had been there before me. Upon closer examination of the walls, I found two delicate types of formation. The first resembled several chunks of grated cheese, tied together on one end, with the rest of the cheese just flopping down. The second formation was just tiny strands of rock. Thinner than human hair, it looked pretty cool. I found several examples of both kind of formations. I was not even through the second section of the cave, and I could barely hear B. Cave passages are not very acoustically friendly. I shouted to him that I would go for a half hour, then return. He said that would be fine, and to be careful. Then I proceeded to explore some more. I could walk nearly upright at this point. I was in the third section of the cave when I discovered a crystal formation on the wall to my right. I was in It was in several layers on the wall, resembling clear candle wax that was allowed to melt and drip from the wall. There were several small stalactite-looking formations formed by these crystals. The longest was about 4 inches in length. There would be one much longer, judging by the size of the base, but it had broken off. I looked to see if I could locate where it ended up, but I couldn't find it. The passage continues for another 100 feet or so before the cave opened up a little. It was at the end of this short, straight segment of the cave. At the very end of the segment, the cave made a bend to the left and opened up into a room. Just at this point where the room began, there was a round rock that appeared to be leaning against the wall. This seemed odd, but singular formations are common in caves, so it is by no means unique. I had crawled and stepped over several large chunks of rock that fell down from the ceiling, but this one was more round than the others. Once past the rock, the room opened up to a height of about 15 feet. It was about 15 feet in width and about 30 feet in length. At the far end of the room was another passage leading straight out. As I entered the room, I had an eerie feeling. It was like the old saying that I felt like I was being watched. Once again, the excitement of the new find faded, and the memories of the mysterious side of the cave crept back into my mind. I felt very alone, suddenly. Fortunately for my ego, I was nearly out of time, and had to get back to B before my half hour was up. I took several pictures of the room. I was going to just get a feel for how long the next passage was when something caught my eye. On the left side of the room, on the wall at about eye level, I discovered what appeared to be hieroglyphics. It was a single drawing that almost appeared to be part of the rock correlation. It looked like very crude representations of people, standing below a symbol. I was pumped. This meant that there had to be another entrance to the cave. Even if the other entrance was closed or blocked off, it might mean an opportunity to open it and get B into the cave. I took another look at the drawing to make sure I could describe it to B. Then I took some more pictures and headed back. When I got back to the squeeze, I could barely talk fast enough to let B know everything that I discovered. He was just as excited to hear about our newly found treasures. As we debated what our next move would be, I began to send my gear back through the tune to B. I told him it would be best if we get someone else to come back with me, in case something happened. He agreed. Once I got all my gear, though, I was faced with the wonderful task of having to negotiate Floyd's tomb again. Theoretically, a person should be able to get out of a passage he just crawled through by simply reversing what he just did. If he contorts his body a certain way to get in, he should be able to get into the same position to get out. In practice, this may not prove to be possible or practical, such was the case with the tomb. I determined in advance that I would attempt to go head first through the squeeze. I know that I could definitely make it back by going feet first, but that would mean backing up all the way through the tomb, and that would take a long time and be very exhausting. My only concern in going head first was when I got to the end of the squeeze, I would have to get through the hole we had made through the benefits of being able to twist my body. Oh well. I chose to go in head first and deal with the exit when I got to it. I started to squeeze, started going into it very close to the tight spot, so at least, I would have it over with soon. It turned out to be tricky getting through. I had to shift my hips to the right a little to get through, but I just kept plugging away at it. My hands were once again by my side. My head was turned to the right, and I was scooting with my toes. Once again, I was using my head as a gauge to tell me, when I was at the tight spot. That's when I was past it. I seemed to get tired a little quicker on the way out. Must have been from all the work we had done, to get through. It was a little over halfway when something bizarre had happened. I was laying there taking a brief break when I heard a sound deep from the cave. It was the faint but distant sound of rock sliding on rock. My blood froze in its veins. I couldn't move. I just lay there straining to hear the sound again. Nothing. I quickly began to scoot towards the exit. I didn't mention the sound to B, but I did recall one of our earlier trips when B said he heard the same thing. The task of getting out of the hole turned out to be as painful as I thought it would be. I had to put my arms overhead and force my shoulders through the hole. I definitely left some skin behind as I slipped through. B helped me as I wiggled my upper body out of the passages. Then I could catch myself and ease my lower body out of the tomb. I was out. B and I shook hands and began to load up our gear. I was trying to listen to any sounds coming from the hole, but we were making too much noise gathering our stuff. As much as I looked forward to getting into the passage, it was a relief to get back out. That is pretty much how I feel about caves in general. I love to go in, but I feel good when I get back out again. Something strange happened with the pictures I took in the new part of the cave, though. The pictures I took leading up to the large room turned out all just fine. Strangely, none of the pictures taken in the room turned out. Pictures of the round rock, and more importantly, pictures of the hieroglyphics I saw, pictures taken before and after the room turned out great, but the negatives of the photos taken in the room were clear. Nothing. I remember what the hieroglyphics looked like, so I drew a picture to give you an idea of what I'd saw. Well, would you look at the time code on that? Whew. over 40 minutes. Man, this has been a pretty interesting and lengthy part. Interesting in the sense that if the first part explained how caving worked, this showed us what this cave was all about. Now, a big majority of it was squeezing through this passage, and for the most part it was getting pretty descriptive, and I guess we could have tied down on that a little bit and focused more on the actual event that happened later on, but whatever, it did still keep my interest, and I learned something new about caving, which, hey, I like learning new stuff, so thank you, Creepypasta. But as we went on through, we realized Ted had entered this virgin cave, and, you know, in a way, I kind of felt the same little bit of accomplishment that they felt, too. It's written in that way where it's really personal, it's really nice, and you kind of feel for it as well. But moving on, exploring the caves, we come across all these little, we come across these crystal formations, a special type of rocks that form, and alongside pictures, it's actually really helpful because we actually get to visualize really well what the hell even goes on in this cave. So, thank you for the pictures. Now, towards the end of it, which is the interesting part, we come across these hieroglyphics, which, fortunately, I guess, somehow the camera stopped working, which I guess that can happen, but apparently the camera didn't work, and we never got to see the actual picture of a hieroglyphic rather than, just the artist representation of them, which, fine enough, okay, well, at least that was given to us. One of the things that we also came across was a sound that is being heard, screams even. And it's interesting. It's kind of intriguing because now I'm kind of wondering what the heck is going to go on with this. What is going to show up at the end of it? Because right now I'm thinking it's either an animal or, at this point, I don't want to jump to a demon conclusion because that's way too far-fetched, but I'm thinking it's some kind of rabid animal or whatever, but we won't know until we read the final part of Ted the Caver. So far, the story is getting interesting. There's a lot of description. Sometimes I feel there's a little too much description being given, but at the same time, I can sort of let it subside because the story itself is actually intriguing, and there is a lot of build-up, obviously, for something this lengthy. So I'm not going to keep you here for too long. Tune in tomorrow for the finale to Ted the Caver. We're going to read the final part of this. We're going to see what even happens with the story, what happens to Ted and Bea, and I'll see you tomorrow when we conclude Ted the Caver. This has been another episode of Creepypastas, a long episode of Creepypastas, probably the longest one we've done. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.